man, I always have to kind of bring out and set on the table. Like it's a weird thing when you go from interacting with someone across temporal pull apart time with like I've watched a lot of your videos, and so going from that to like all of a sudden now you're interacting back with me, it's always like a weird thing. So I just like to bring that up so I don't have to run it in the back of my mind like, oh holy shit, I'm talking to Jordan Hall right now. So there.
Yeah, I get it. I make it a habit actually when I go to the gym to watch somebody's podcast, whoever happens to be. I'm just going to call them podcasts. I don't know what the kids call them these days. And I was watching John Vervaeke's conversation with Bishop Maximus, I believe is his name.
Yeah.
And yeah, had that exact experience. Like I was actually writing a comment on the YouTube video, having the experience of being in that place of watching. But then in the back of my mind, knowing that this Wednesday I'm going to have a symmetric conversation with John, and noticing that there's a yeah, I think it's actually kind of like a frame. You know the experience of when you get into an elevator and then the elevator doors open and you're in a new place. I think it's just as simple as that. Like, I don't think it's particularly complex. I think it's just there's an identity structure that goes away and then a new identity structure rolls up, and they're just different.
Yeah. And then there's this whole like physiologic response. I was watching, I think it's just called Dialogos number 2 between John, Christopher, Guy, and yourself from 3 years ago. And I think you started off the conversation by talking about the sense of like almost like pre-game jitters that you get in your body. And it's very much that kind of thing. And I've noticed that like the first time I talked to John on his channel, that was like almost overwhelming, right? It took me the first half hour to like move out of that to where it's like, okay, now I'm actually talking instead of just like.
Interesting.
So okay, so I try to bring it up and get it out of the way first.
Always good. I've had this conversation in person too. It's a different quality of thing. So I was staying near in my parents' place near Austin for about 4 months. So I was going up to Austin periodically, and every once in a while I had an opportunity to have a sit down conversation with some folks that I'd never met before, but had watched videos of me, and so that was it's probably more intense, I'm guessing, just because the physicality of it and the three-dimensionality of it.
Yeah.
Well, I suspect that this is an entree to a topic that I've been contemplating a lot recently, and I don't want to hijack the conversation at all. You had, I think, some very interesting questions when you sent me the message to potentially chat. But what's the toolkit, like the appropriate set of skills or skillfulness that, let's just say, we're all going to need as we begin to move into in particular, the digital future, the networked future more fully. So I'm not sure if this is the right venue for that conversation. It's just has to be top of mind for me, but
well, maybe it can come. I mean, that might be a good strand to kind of bring along with us, because, the background I would put on this conversation would be something like, imagine a space of like a troop of chimps, and one chimp is doing things that somebody else notices are like, okay, they're doing a really good job of this. Like, I don't know what they're doing exactly or how they're doing this, but I want to be more like that. And my life, to the degree that my life has gone well, it's mostly been a result of me being intentional about doing that, like identifying people around me who are like in my proximity that seem to be making effective choices and being careful in how they conduct their lives, and then like going towards them and being like, hey, how are you doing this? And then actually listening to what they say. So like, that's kind of what I want to talk to you about, because when I watch your videos, whether you're in a conversation with someone or whether you're just like your deep code videos or those kinds of things, like what I notice is, like, obviously you have an impressive processing capability, but most people who have that, it seems, have a difficulty in transmitting the frames that processor comes up with in a way that people across levels can understand. And when I watch you talk or listen to you talk or see you engage with other people, you seem to be able to fit to what the other person is working with with a lot of sensitivity, but also a lot of, like, you don't lose the punch, if you will, of the power of the kinds of frames you're bringing to bear, but you don't overwhelm it with linguistic terms or things that get in the way, it seems like. So that's the kind of thing that I've been noticing. And I'm like, I want to be able to do that. I want to learn how to conduct myself in a way that I can connect with people.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So I know I'm kind of throwing a lot of stuff on the table here, but that's kind of like, that's the gist of what I'm asking.
This is, yeah. So the thing that made me laugh was something like, I find myself quite tickled or appreciate when something has multiple levels of self-referentiality. And so we're right now in the process of endeavoring to simultaneously demonstrate the thing that you're referencing, while being aware of the fact that we're engaging in something like a pedagogical examination of the thing itself.
Yeah.
Okay. And in my own mind, I'm also running something here like, okay, how can I actually kind of do something where I'm moving back and forth between levels of doing and articulating somewhat elegantly? Okay, so let's see. I'll just do it almost in order. Caveat. You said it in a particular way, and I nodded because I think the way you framed it was just right. Obviously, you and I are currently talking. So my primary focus is on establishing conversation with you, which means that there may be many people, if we decide to share this, for whom the conversation may not be particularly transparent.
Yeah.
I currently haven't achieved the facility of being able to have a conversation that is kind of like the Swiss Army knife, meaning it actually works for literally anybody arbitrarily across all possible space and time.
Yeah. It's like a pure symbolic conversation. That's just unreal.
That feels like a really neat thing to play with, possibly.
Yeah.
But it's certainly beyond my capacity. So that's important, right? Because I do find that in the space of a particular dialogue, and by the way, I mean, when I say dialogue, I'm referring to a particular style of conversation, which involves, for example, that you're also interested in entering into dialogue, and there's a bunch of preconditions, like we're operating in good faith, we both have a certain capacity and skillfulness of listening and perceiving and expressing, etc. The conversation can land. And so 4 people, as you mentioned, the conversations with Chris and Guy and John, maybe more in person, 6 to 8. 8 seems like a lot. More than 8 feels pretty rough. But also, I certainly have received plenty of commentary that oftentimes the vocabulary that I choose or the style of communication that I use seems to cause people to be, let's just say, upset. So both are true. And it's not universal, but it's certainly plenty. Okay, so that's just a caveat.
It's almost like you have a certain like coupling mechanism of your linguistic style, and it works sometimes, but not always.
Well, it works mostly in feedback. So if I'm actually talking with you, then we can begin to find a coupling, literally a protocol.
Sure.
But if I've never, if you're just a person coming from the internet watching a video, by definition, there's no feedback. And so I can't communicate with that particular individual. And if the protocol doesn't achieve resonance with them, it's effectively arbitrarily, then they may actually have a bad experience. So that's that as far as I can tell.
Okay.
So let's talk about the notion of protocol. And this is, okay, cool. This is very interesting. What I mentioned earlier in terms of, what's the toolkit? What do we need to actually operate and develop a new form of network collective intelligence, which I may start calling the neocortex.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
This is a big piece of that, this capacity. Okay. So there's a dispositional element, which I just mentioned. And so I am in fact endeavoring to communicate with you. And by that, I don't mean to convey content. I mean to open a channel whereby dialogue can occur. And notice the distinction. And I think this is a lot of what people who have fast processors have a challenge. And I'll also give my diagnosis, which is that because they have a high processor, they have a lot of content. And because they haven't really developed skillfulness in opening a channel, they have not a lot of people that they actually can share that content with. Yeah. So they have a felt sense of a need to be heard. So what ends up happening is they end up broadcasting that content because they need to actually be heard. And that's a diagnosis, by the way. It may be completely wrong, but it's something that I feel pretty comfortable saying because I've certainly played with it and experimented with it quite a bit.
Yeah, it resonates very strongly with me. I mean, I would, 100%.
And you can see this often if you just sort of pay attention when a new group forms. Sometimes you'll see an individual who seemingly just cannot resist just yammering in a large group context, not paying any attention to the social signals. And it's largely because they have something that needs to be expressed, and they're sort of past the threshold of being able to do so in an orderly fashion.
Yeah.
All right. So, there's like, I feel like there's two levels here. One level, the three. The first level is dispositional.
Okay.
And there's a lot of cool stuff that we talk about there. So I'll kind of leave it to you to figure out what's the best way to navigate and investigate.
Sure.
So one level is that level of dispositional, things about embodiment, things about a notion of what it is we're even trying to do and why we would do it, like basic assumptions, emotional awareness, like the ability to actually not get mad when somebody says something you don't understand, stuff like that. Okay, one level above that is the level that I really identify with Benito Roy's notion of mapping, and particularly the notion of mapping errors. So this would be the metacognitive move, right? The ability to actually say, oh, right, language and models are useful and maybe, in fact, in many ways necessary for communication. If you and I didn't both speak English, we'd have a much harder time communicating than that we do. And to the degree to which we have words that either we don't understand mutually, or worse, they have different meanings. Then there's a disambiguation thing that needs to occur. And in that second level, the more you are actually aware of that fact and have developed an awareness, like a skillfulness of, oh, this is a disambiguation problem. You say, my mind goes, oh, I don't understand that word. Right? First level, and I'm not going to get angry about it. But second level triggers an immediate, at this point, the only appropriate thing, if we want to move forward in this point of the conversation, is to slow down and engage in something like a disambiguation, which can be explicit. What did you mean by that? Or it can be inferential. I'm going to listen very closely to what it is you're talking about until it feels like I'm actually getting the vibe of what it is you're saying. And then I'll try to express back to you in a fashion that gets the a feedback of saying, yes, we're kind of vibing together.
Yeah.
That last part, okay, so then the third layer is something like, the easiest example is the classic ambassador who speaks 12 languages. The more paradigms, the more models, the more schema that you're familiar with, first order or first the more easy it is for that second level to actually just be the case. If you're like, okay, sure. I can speak sort of scientific materialism. I can also speak sort of new age idealist. I can speak, I've got a vague sort of third grade education level in kind of the various flavors of Christian theology. Like, okay, cool. I've got this toolkit of paradigms, methods of speaking that I have familiarity with. So it's more likely that I'm not going to assume or imagine that any one of them is obligate. I'm going to be able to go, okay, would they think the phrase they use something like code switching? Okay, there's code and I can code switch. But then the third is that I can then make access, I can have reference to that large store of different ways of saying something, and being able to actually notice how you can, I'll use the word rotate, which gives my experience of it is you can rotate them around the vibe, around the transcendent thing that is endeavoring to be expressed, to try to find and bricolage or assemble in real time a bespoke model, a communications protocol with the person you're interacting with that actually starts to achieve effectiveness.
Clarity is a nice word that comes up for me there, because it's the sense of like being able to look through the amalgam of the different models that you're bringing to bear toward the thing in itself, which is coming out.
Yes, yes, this is very nice. Yeah, and fittedness is another similar sense. And notice what happened just there is like you put a word clarity, and of course in me, I'm now feeling, okay, that's an interesting, powerful word. What's the sense of that? And I'm coming back at you with another word that to me is different in particular, but vibes with that. And like, okay, are we beginning to play in a space where simultaneously we're pulling forth signifiers, words, and attaching them to the much more complex thing that we'll call meaning? Well, I'll propose we could call meaning for a moment. Noticing that, by the way, that's a very complex term that has at least 3 distinct senses that all combine together.
Sure.
Yeah, and then we can begin to do the thing, right? We can actually begin to have a real dialogue and begin to play with whatever. What do you say? There's an example. Okay, so what's happening here? I'm noticing that there's something that seems particularly meaningful that wants to be expressed, and habitually noticing, okay, by practice, now's a good time to slow down and like allow that to be a little bit more clear in my own sensibility, so that I can express it with more clarity in between us. So, unfortunately, the move of stepping back, I got out of it, so I don't remember what I was going to say.
Well,
I do.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. No, of course.
It seems like that's a big part of the point of us being like, why are we here? What does it mean to be human? Like, what's this whole story about? And it seems like a big part of it is associated with that. Like, we have this weird thing that we can simultaneously utter sounds and move our hands and make facial expressions. We can signify something, right? We can signify something between each other. That seems like a really interestingly important thing. All right, that's all on that for the moment for me.
Sure. Well, I guess, oh my goodness, there's so many places to pick up there. So I'm just trying to sense into which one is. Okay, so I'll pick up on that then, the sensing into. Maybe that's the right thing to pick up on, because, and that's the real feeling that I had when you talked about level 2, is every time there's some kind of disconnection that comes up in the language framing, right? And the sense of like, oh, the way you use that word didn't feel like how I would use that word. And there's an opportunity there to ignore it and let it go, or to like actually like take it seriously. And that is a place where I don't know, man, there's so many places along as you walk through those levels, which is beautiful, by the way, where I feel myself, I look at myself and how I do conversations. And it's like, oh yeah, so there's where I go off the rails there. There's where I go off the rails when I do that thing. There's where I go off the rails when I do that thing. And so I'm pointing out that sensing of an ambiguity, and on occasion a lack of taking that seriously and leaning in through it, that has gotten me off base. That's one of the places where I can tend to jump off the rails.
So one of the things that just came up, and I'll put it out there, what I was feeling there was something like I'm not a particularly good athlete, but I've played a lot of sports, and I've, spent the requisite thousands of hours in a lot of them. And it's good evidence that something is fundamental about my lack of athletic ability, not a matter of practice. I've shot a lot of free throws, and I'm probably still only about a 30% free throw shooter. But one of the things that I noticed in that context was for a long time, and even still probably now, although I haven't done it in a while, the thing performance anxiety. or more specifically, trying to shoot a free throw while you are simultaneously trying to see how other people see you shooting a free throw and trying to be aware of how you're shooting a free throw is a shitty way of trying to shoot a free throw.
Yes.
And same thing with juggling, right? Juggling is not the kind of thing that you want to be metacognitive about while you are juggling. Juggling is the kind of thing that you want to practice without being metacognitive about it. Or golf. I remember making the very clear learning of throw away the book, throw away anything anybody has ever said. Like, you don't want to be in a propositional space when you're playing golf. Like, you really need to be all the way into just being present to the experience. And then what will happen is trust that your system knows how to learn things, that your mind awareness, sort of that thing doesn't need to be involved in it all and is going to get in the way. It can be really interested to see development occur, and offline can write shit down and be, maybe even profound about what just happened, but it doesn't have a particular role to play in developing capacity. And I was noticing that in our conversation where I was saying, wow, this is actually really difficult to try to simultaneously be in, let's call it like the flow of dialogue, while trying to be very meta aware of exactly what's going on, not just sort of like being conscious of it, but actually being like precisely aware. And my sense is that's actually just not the right way of doing it. The right way of doing it is do it. And then in some sense, trust that the facility for doing it is just a natural faculty of a human being. And that it's a practice like juggling. And that as you build the facility in that practice, your awareness is afforded the opportunity to play its role, but offline. I would say, my guess. I'm just guessing that that's probably a right way of doing it. And it would, how to say this right? Are you familiar with the concept of eustress, or like in the pocket in terms of learning?
I don't think so.
So the notion is something like let's say you're rock climbing, and there's like 3 different walls that you're climbing, and one wall is like a 20% grade with, so you could walk up it. Not challenging. You're not learning anything in that mode, so no stress. And then the second rock wall is like a negative 15% grade and is completely covered in oil, right? So there's no chance to do it. And let's make it even worse. Like, you get halfway up and then it becomes impossible. So you're hanging 20 feet in the air and you're like, wow, distress, right? You're not learning there either. Yeah. In fact, you may in fact be getting traumatized. Yeah. Eustress, right? The rock wall is sort of right beyond the level that you're at, so that you're being pushed, but you're not being pushed beyond your capacity to develop more capacity, right? You notice that there's a bunch of different sort of shifts there. So or the pocket, right? The same basic idea. Like when you're surfing, when you feel the zone where the wave can be surfed, right? The energy of the wave, the shape of the wave, the positioning of your board, like the possibility of surfing is now alive. You're now in the zone where your personal skillfulness is the deciding factor. If you're not in the pocket, you're not going to surf, no matter how good you are. A big part of being good at surfing is getting in the pocket. We'll ignore that for now. If you're in the pocket, okay, now, can you actually do it? Once you're in the pocket, the next challenge is, like, let's say you popped up and you're on the wave. Can you maintain that dynamic play between being in the pocket and having the skillfulness to be in the pocket? And that's a really nice metaphor. So those are 2 different pieces. So the premise would be something like, you want to be in that place of eustress with regard to this particular practice. So trying to be too meta aware, like it's too much. Now, by virtue of saying that, I might also say my previous point about not doing it might actually just be evidence of my own lack of capacity to like, hold a bigger piece. Like, great, if you could find yourself, okay, let me try to be more meta aware of what I'm doing, but inside the zone where I'm still flowing in the pocket. Nice. Yeah. After doing that for a while, I can get more expansive.
Yeah.
Plausible. Seems entirely plausible.
It's almost, I guess the notion that's coming up is like John's metaoptimal grip in like a developmental process.
Nice.
And like, so I guess with that, because so I'm trying to analyze and bring in kind of my approach to this conversation in the first place, because it's kind of more of a metacognitive looking at the way that I am generally engaging in conversations, whether it's if it's with someone who has a sense of, say, the process of dialogos, it tends to be quite straightforward, it seems, for that to begin to occur. But no, not always, but that seems fairly available. That space of bringing these three levels that you talked about, like allowing that to kind of cohere and operate, such that if I can, and tell me if this is fair, if I can take your three levels and say that, okay, if those are operating, maybe that affords the happening of dialogos. Is that fair?
Yep.
So let's
notice the metaphor of the dance, meaning there's a notion of, and you brought it in, right? If you're interacting with someone who has a particular level of skillfulness, then the total happening, the wholeness, is able to achieve that particular state where dialogos emerges as a space. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I would propose that the metaphor of dancing is quite nice, is that if you're extremely skillful as a dance partner, the other partner's skillfulness doesn't have to be as high, but they have to have a disposition and willingness to participate. It's very difficult for somebody to dance, no matter how good you are, if they just don't freaking want to dance, right? So, and if the mutual skillfulness isn't there, then the space is going to have a hard time emerging. And so there you go.
Yeah. Yes. So when I came to this conversation, part of my sense is I often get bound up in creating negative feedback loops within myself because I notice myself attempting to make it happen when the other person doesn't want to dance. I feel like I'm trying to force other people to dance, and it's really actually caused me some problems in some of my relationships.
Sure.
And I noticed that, and I'm like, it's something that over time has gotten better. But then I'm like, okay, am I running too metacognitive a practice or of a process when I'm trying to do that? Right? It's I guess the notion that's coming in is like, in the Platonic dialogues, how Socrates has to seduce people into wanting the good versus like yell at them for it or something like that. Does it?
Well, I'll make it very personal because I think that's a good case study. Like with your family, or family is really good. Do you have kids?
I have a 3-month-old.
Okay. So boy or girl? Girl. So when she's 13, as a kind of the most relevant, although when she's 2, but that's a different issue. Or not. Yeah, it's a different issue. When she's 13 or 20. Yeah, like it's a very tricky business, to be perfectly frank. On the one hand, there's a real desire to engage in dialogos with the people who you care about the most. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean this like in a nerdy formal way. I mean, being in really beautiful presence and mutual dialogue for the purpose of maximally enriching relationship. Mm-hmm. I don't talking about nerdy stuff. I mean, whatever happens to be the most meaningful. And this is where it gets very subtle. Okay. And that always has to be very perfectly symmetric, meaning, while I can find myself entering into a nurturing or nutritive dialogos with, say, John, when we're talking about metaoptimal grip, that's not the sort of thing that my daughter is particularly at all interested in, like 0%. Okay, so what that means is I have to find the place, the pocket that's actually available between us. And in some sense, it may not be much. It may, in some sense, and in that sense, that sensitivity to that nuance is I just want to kind of hit on that a little bit. From one point of view, right? From the point of view of like a shareable YouTube video, it's not going to be, the content that is produced is not going to be fancy or big, right? At an intellectual level. Yeah. And she will want to share with me something, but that from a point of view of kind of like, let's say my ego perspective, is not interesting. Okay. But that's not the point of dialogos, right? This is where Socrates gets to be a distraction, right? We know Socrates from the point of view of dialogues around big picture, big ticket items, right? The kind of stuff you put in a book and you pass forward into the generations ahead of you and gives you a famous name. But this is a big one. But the point, deep point, is meaningfulness, and meaningful is you, and meaningfulness of your experience.
Uh-oh. Jordan, are you there?
You're frozen on my screen. I can hear you.
Oh, goodness. I think, okay. You're coming back here. I wonder if something has happened with my internet.
Now I can hear you.
Okay. I can hear you again. You're no longer frozen.
Okay, good.
Okay. Oh.
So, I mean, I'm not sure. This will be a place that we'll have to actually, like I'm putting up the signal that we are entering into a new dance. So there will be some fumbling and sliding and stepping on toes. I imagine. All right. So all right. There's a way of being in relationship that is ultimately, at the end of the day, something like ego driven. Things like status and identity. And in that particular frame, there's a measuring of what's happening. The point of view of what's the right way of thinking of the notion of measuring, a measuring, which is to say a standard that is being applied to what's happening, that endeavors to judge the value of what's happening on the basis of that standard. And it may be the standard of, is this worth my time? Or a standard of, is this going to be perceived as important by other people? Or the standard of, is this going to further my ability to have my name inscribed on a marble tablet 10,000 years from now? Whatever, right?
Yeah.
Is it going to pay me money? Right? That kind of thing. Like, it's the moment of relationship is being held to a standard that is not specifically the moment of relationship. And the proposition I would make is that is a violation of the most fundamental point, meaning, essence of dialogos, dialogue, and by the way, relationship, and is in violation of the notion of meaningfulness. And so the most meaningful is intrinsic. It's in its own terms. So now we can actually do, how old did you say your daughter was? 6 months?
3 months.
3 months.
Yeah.
Perfect. Right? Right? It's perfect, right? Your experience with your 3-month-old daughter is, it can be, I said this actually is funny. Yesterday I was out to eat, and a family was nearby, and they had probably about a 3-month-old sitting in one of those, carryable, right? And she was flirting with me, doing a baby thing. Hey, there's a face I've never met. What's that all about? And I was interacting with her, and I was noticing there's something like very young children, old people who have lived their lives cleanly. From my experience, I don't know if this is universal, beautiful women, that brings me into a place of experiencing the transcendent most easily. And so the presence of the absolute cleanliness, the pristine purity, the absolute clarity of the availability of meaningfulness in the dialogos with your 3-month-old daughter is the essence of it. You're not going to be having a fancy pants conversation. It's going to look really cool on video with her. And that's proper. Like, that's the more correct. Like, that's the actual thing itself is the experience you can have with her. And then, like, what we're having, to the degree to which it's akin to that, is good. And the further you get from that into fancy dance and things that can be sold, things that can be judged according to a standard that is outside of the experience itself, the further you're getting away. Right? Yeah.
Well, and the more difficult. Okay, gosh. So there's so many things there. One that I would like to point out is that when you talked about the violation, it's like the violation happens at the first level of the dispositional space. It's like the disposition of placing myself in service to. I think you called it the meaningfulness of the moment,
Mm.
as opposed to attempting to move toward something that I perceive to be a higher order, thing to bring into the space.
Yes.
This instrumentality of it. Okay. So I'm always trying to turn toward I always feel a pull toward how do I make this real in my life kind of question. Right. And so when, so it's coming up for me is like the notion of surrender. And I've worked with this a lot already with my daughter. It's like having kids, man, like the surrender that is required is just unreal.
That's putting it mildly. Yeah.
How many kids do you have?
3.
Okay. Yeah.
All daughters.
Oh, nice. And how old is the oldest?
20.
Oh, okay. So nice. Okay, then you have much to teach me in many areas. But one of the things that I've realized and learned with her is even when I go to put her down for a nap, if I am there trying to get her to go to sleep so that I can go away, it takes her much longer to go to sleep.
Yes.
Whereas if I'm there and just there and like, hey, we're trying to go to sleep and I care about you and I'm just here until you go to sleep with no like polling on it. There's a different kind of thing that happens. And it's like, not only am I more at peace, but she like, I haven't actually timed it, but like, I think the felt sense of how quickly she relaxes into the space of being able to sleep is wild.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is like, is it the practice of attempting to hold a disposition towards interactions instead of prioritizing the content of the interactions? Is that the kind of thing that like calls forward more of that? Because that's what I'm trying to get at. I'm like, I want to try to like prioritize, even at the level of my metacognitive analysis of myself, the kind of thing that pulls me more into the way of being that allows for goodness to happen.
Yeah. I'm going to pull it apart a little bit to make it a little easier, to be honest. Like,
yeah,
there's a place where you can get very tight. And I was actually feeling it in my body as sort of like painfully intense. There's a subtlety and nuance and holding it. So I'll pull out a little bit. If you're in a mode of relationship with any aspect of reality, I'll just be as broad and call it, categorical as that, where you're endeavoring to experience that for the purposes of selling it. For the purposes of exploiting it, for the purposes of using it in a way that is not consensual with the moment itself, right? And saying that in a very interesting way. That's fucked. And I mean that formally, meaning you are now separate from the experience and you are operating in a particular mode. This is a very common mode, right? It's the mode that most of us spend most of our time in. It's the mode, weirdly, that actually, because we spend most of our time in, and most effectively all of our cultures have been immersed up to the neck in that mode for what I would say is, in fact, the whole of history. Right? So that's the very large sort of environment. Almost all the skillfulness that we've learned in how to navigate life is of that mode. Yeah. So if you want to get shit done, you're going to be doing it in that mode, and that's fucked. This is a very clean way of articulating the problem that we are at. Right? That's the real sort of stickiness. But there's this other mode, and weirdly, or not weirdly, beautifully, but somewhat consternatingly, This other mode is the one where your daughter really does actually fall asleep. Right?
Yeah.
Smoothly, elegantly, with no emotional, no trauma for either one of you. In fact, a maximum felt sense of sacredness and peacefulness. And boy, I sure am glad I'm a father right now. Yeah. And that I'd say that's meaningfulness, right? And this is that interesting meaningful in the sense of like means to an end. It literally is the optimal grip for the means to the end, while simultaneously one categorically not being subordinating the experience to a purpose that is separate from the experience, right? That's the conundrum, right? This is this thing like, hey, look, you will actually be able to achieve your values more fully, more completely, more richly, more easily, more enduringly, more beautifully by means of this mode than the alternative mode. And in the context of this mode, none of that matters.
Yeah. Yes. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And so
super not good at it.
Yeah. And I think, okay, so my kind of like core operating system is like fundamentalist Christianity. That's what I grew up with.
Okay. Which subset? Calvinist. Is there an elect or do good works work?
So that was always a contention point, but it was something like Anabaptist. Okay. But and so I've that's always playing in my mind ever since, right? So for me, one of the things that I hear in what you're saying is like just that's the move towards sin, right? That's like the fundamental move toward being in an operating system of sin.
Yes. Yeah. When I say fuck, I mean sin.
Yeah.
As far as I can tell, like it's not my, I didn't grow up in that world, so I'm not exactly sure. But as far as I can tell, that is what I'm.
Yeah. To miss the mark and everything, all that. Okay. So I don't want to go down that road, but what
separated from God.
Yeah, exactly. And to die and all that stuff. Like it works great. But where I wanted to go. So, okay, here's where I was. So there's, the emphasis that I had and continues to, kind of subconsciously be something that I work with is this sense of like the ego needs to die. Like the thing that is holding the frames that allows me to do this instrumentality move. Like I'm trying to like kill that, right? And I don't that doesn't seem to be helpful. There's all kinds of I don't want to go there's a whole thing there, but like it's such a loud thing, but I don't necessarily want to engage with it in that kind of way. Also, it doesn't even work because you're kind of doing the thing while doing it that way. So sorry, I'm just working through this as I'm going. But I want the question is like how to allow for that to become redeemed, if I can use that word, while not trying to take it offline, right? Like how, like that kind of thing. Am I making sense there?
Absolutely. I mean, for me, so let me say back to you what well, not exactly, but in the vein. The way it has worked for me is to say, and redeemed is nice. I like redeemed. I actually even go stronger, honored. Ego needs to be honored. But that means it needs to actually be put in its proper place. The problem is not that we have an ego. The problem is the ego has usurped the throne. Okay. And that may, the notion of the steward in the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
The king, for whatever reason, is not currently present. We're not going to get there yet, but maybe ever. But the king, for whatever reason, the steward maybe was actually kind of like, wow, I'm not the king. I don't, what the heck? How am I supposed to be in charge of this thing? Maybe this is like at 3 or 4. Something's going on where this piece of us being put more and more in the foreground as being responsible for doing all kinds of things. And it's kind of like, dude, this is not my gig. That's not what I'm supposed to be doing. But at some point, something happens where we lose track of that. And suddenly we are using that aspect of ourselves as if it were the whole of ourselves. And now we're in trouble. Yeah. So the move of the ego needs to be killed, kind of like a little bit from its point of view. When it lost track of what its proper role is, no longer being on the throne is the same, is close enough to being killed that it's going to fight as if it's going to be killed. Right? So you're just looking at it going, well, here's the interesting thing. And I can't help it now because you kind of opened up the Christian language. It's like, look, you're going to be killed.
Yeah.
I got good news, though. You're going to be reborn.
Yeah.
You're going to be reborn in the proper relationship so that you will be truly honored. You will, in fact, be reborn and redeemed. Right? Now, that's a good story for the ego. The ego can kind of like, you can lay down the things that you've been carrying that you know are not yours to carry, and lay down your burdens. Like, do the thing that you're here to do, and you will be supported by a much larger self. Yeah, something that is larger than you. Notice the interesting, up higher and lower references there. Yeah, so that you can do your job properly and be honored. Therefore, right? That's the deal. Like, that's the relationship. The deal I cut. And when everything is, in the pocket, that works very well. I would say quite nicely. Particularly in this world. And then the reality is that you got to buy groceries. You're going to have to get on Zoom calls properly. And that's the ego's, that's its shtick. It's going to be really useful to know how to do that. And so you're going to have a hard time if you're completely obliterated that capacity in doing a whole lot. So anyway, does that now popping into the metacognitive, I did an expression of things that were not, I didn't try to repeat back to you the words you said. I said something very different, but the point is to see if that differential creates we're talking about the same thing.
Yes, no, absolutely. Absolutely. We're talking about the same thing. Nice. And like for a while, I really prioritized having the ability to make sense of and look at the ways I was doing things in order to understand, like, okay, this is where, now I've engaged this thing with sin, right? Or this is what it means to surrender. Like, I needed to do all that stuff to separate out, this is what redemption is about because that was so convoluted for me, right? And this is what sin is about because that was so convoluted and all this stuff. And it's like, okay, now we've done that. Obviously, I don't understand fully redemption and sin and all that stuff. I'm not claiming that, but I'm just saying, in my own experience of being myself, those things had to come into being in a way that I could interact with them. Maybe you could say they become symbols instead of concepts.
Nice.
They're no longer just conceptual frames, but they're things that I can see through and understand the way they have this dynamical, interpenetrating relationship with who I am. And so it's okay, so now if I can understand that, that's great. But so I have two primary arenas where I function in my day-to-day life. One is I practice medicine. And so and that's been tremendously helpful in this because I get to engage in the kind of space with people where this kind of thing tends to happen more easily. Because there's already a kind of felt sense of vulnerability and my life is kind of blown up in front of me. And so I'm actually willing to engage kinds of things that I wouldn't from the perspective of my interlocutor. So that's been cool, but it's still me at work. So I'll oftentimes, spin down way out of this space. And so I can no longer see and I'm stuck in these frames. So and to bring in the other arena is just the normal life, right? Going to the store and taking care of my daughter and helping my wife and maintaining a healthy relationship with my wife as we navigate, what does our relationship look like now that we have a child to take care of, right? All those kinds of things are really, they're interesting fields to navigate, but it's I no longer want to necessarily just understand what is happening when the ability to be in the meaningfulness goes away. I don't want to just understand why. I want to hear the music to come back, regardless of where I am. And I know that's a great,
No, you are not alone in this, and I got bad news. It's hard. Yeah,
I'm well aware, but my sense is like there's a way in which, as we do this thing together, right? As all of us engage in doing this thing together, especially those of us that have done it more and heard the music more and say, like, play with it more, that in the doing of it, we start to gain an attunement.
Yep. This, I would say, is actually the meaning of the word church. Okay, you ready?
Yeah.
All right. So you're in the third floor, the practicing medicine. And there's a mastery that you've developed, I'll just propose, and a vulnerability of the context where the other individual is actually really open, where the opening of this space is particularly available. Okay. And then you don't have to go, not be in the third floor. Are you in Texas?
I'm in Oregon.
Oregon, okay. You get in your car, you drive home, you go through traffic where this is not available at all. Let's say on the way home, you have to stop at the grocery store. So you go to the grocery store, again, not particularly available. You do all the various mundane things that are mundane, like the exact opposite of not the opposite, the middle space, not profane, but mundane. Yeah. Perilously close to profane in too many cases. And then you get home, right? And if you're lucky, home is also a sanctuary where this is available. And all the various participants in home have cultivated an orienting ground where they are just naturally playing together. So the attunement holds the space nicely, and presence is there. And so to use the Christian language, the spirit is present in the household. Okay. Now, here's what we want to do. What we want to do is we want to connect those dots in the space of the church. That's what we want. That's the only real way that I think we're going to be able to pull this off at all.
Okay.
If you were to move yourself, let's ignore traffic for the moment. So now you're actually in a small enough town that you're just walking. Okay. And as you encounter your neighbors, as you're walking, every neighbor is also attuned. The spaces open up to whatever is available in that particular encounter, which of course is infinite in possibility. And then you go into the shop, and the shop owner is also attuned, and they're operating the shop in this space, which is a powerful vocation, right? Because they're interacting with lots of people. So one of the deepest vocations would actually be to be playing a role where you're interacting with a lot of people, and one of the primary things you're doing is supporting their being held in that space. So they can bring it stronger out into the streets and back into their home. And then you get home, right? So that's a very different story. Right? So Brett Weinstein would call what I just gave you a valley crossing story. The Torah would call this wandering through the desert to the promised land, right? Which is the same basic idea. So we don't live there. That's what we'd like to get, and I think that is accomplishable. We can pull that off. I'm not sure we will, but we could. And it's certainly plausible that a combination of more people by means of the field effect of the way that our communications milieu allows people to have access to, and that notion of more like that. I see something's going on there that I want to participate in more. So I will turn my attention in that direction. And so through that thing, as more and more people, and then as those who are sort of entering into that church on their own choice, choose to live in places so that more and more of those places are populated by more and more people who are living in that way, you'll start to get archipelago, islands, that are part of the same, they're an archipelago, they're part of a submerged mountain, but for the moment, the ocean level is high. So getting from one to
nice. That's very nice, because you bring in the notion of the flood and everything too.
Oh, nice.
Of chaos. Yeah.
Right. So in between those points in time,
Yeah.
or when you're moving from one archipelago, one island to another island, for me, I would say something like, I can imagine, but I personally have never got even vaguely close to this, that if you were at a high enough level, this like Christ, I would imagine the whole point was able to walk through the villages around the Sea of Galilee and presence the presence regardless of the exterior context.
Right. Right.
Kind of in many ways, that's the point.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
But that ain't me.
Yeah. Yeah.
By any stretch of the imagination.
The bushel comes over the candle easily.
I'm lucky. An airport for me is a case study. Right? I'm lucky if I'm able to hold a sort of a basic level of peace in my heart through, like, across that journey.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
I can do it. I've done that. I've been able to navigate, transitioning from one island to another island and make it all the way through without having fallen into sin, to use that language.
Well, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But I wouldn't say it's often, right? I certainly can't say, yeah. And for that matter, even in the space of my own home, it's not as much as I would like. And I wouldn't even say, it depends. Life has been quite choppy for the past 3 years. So
Sure.
There were periods of time when my youngest daughter was born where we were able to hold that presence for like 6 months. Like the first 6 months, I would say almost entirely, maybe with small pops out. More recently, much less than that. So, yeah, so that would be maybe kind of my first person experience of it, which I imagine would then be instructive or helpful.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. I mean, for one thing, right? Like, part of the reason I attempted to facilitate a connection with you is because I like I said at the beginning of this conversation, right? Like, there's an admiration that I feel towards the way you conduct yourself, right? And so, kind of the connecting of the narratives that we experience the same thing is very helpful for me, right? In the sense of because so let me bring this in, because this is one of the things I've been thinking about, this notion of guilt, because what I experience is, especially the more clarity I have about the ways in which I fall into sin, the more aware I am of the points at which I do it. And the sensation is one of guilt. And that, more than anything, will hold me out of the space. Like, that is like a self-reinforcing negative feedback loop.
Yeah.
And what seems to be happening when that happens is I think it's appropriate to use the notion of the divine double that John uses. That when I'm looking, like, there's an orientation flip that happens, where it's like, maybe the divine double is too much. I'm going to use aspirational self, because I don't think I understand the divine double well enough. It's deeply meaningful to me, but I don't like it's foggy enough that I don't want to use that. So let's say the aspirational self. There's a way in which when I'm in the flow of things, the aspirational self, I'm like looking from the perspective of the aspirational self at the me of the existential self that's happening in the world. And there's a sense of grace that is held for what I'm actually doing and the way things are going wrong, because things are inevitably going wrong. And that, like, energy, I guess, allows for me to continue to do the thing. But when the guilt operation happens when I do a flip down to the existential self, and I look up at the aspirational self and judge myself in accordance with it. How does that sound?
Yeah. I mean, I've certainly experienced that quite often. My personal flavor of it is there's a decent chunk of pride that gets packed into the guilt. And it's a petulant pride. Like it's not a. There's two flavors, right? And it's the petulant pride. I mean, it's almost like I can even name it. It's almost like a 4 to 7 year old petulant pride. It's clearly childish, and that creates a feedback loop. Like,
Yeah.
oh, well, therefore I'm even further away from the aspirational self. Like, oh, wait, I can kind of even notice that you're doing that to keep me here, and yet it's working. Yeah. Yes, very much so. I think this is kind of like the thing. You know, we will stumble and fall. Like you said the word admiration. We just kind of put some stuff in there just to kind of. This is kind of a funny way of saying it, but if I have to think about myself in a positive light, this is I think some of the virtues that I have is that I'm not really that very good. Like I'm not a particularly good man. I'm not a particularly wise man. And I'm not particularly emotionally mature. I'm, not particularly kind, right? Many of the things that I am quite aware of are virtues, and in many ways would be part of my aspirational self. I wouldn't consider myself to be particularly well advanced along those vectors.
Sure.
And what that means is that for those who are like me, we can kind of we can talk, we can chat. Like there's no, I can't judge you, man. There's no way. There's no real capacity to judge you because I am not. I get it. Like there's no throwing stones in this glass house.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
All right. So we will stumble. All right. We will fall, and we will fall into these weird, dark traps where you have, and that flip, I think, is exactly right. Like for me, it's very much that. It's like if I'm here and able to be grounded here, these things can happen, and they don't really matter that much. Right? And I find this in parenting all the time. You know, my youngest daughter, is an absolute expert in teaching me this lesson. Right? She seems to be perfectly committed to doing everything possible to pull me down and build my capacity not to. And actually, by the way, is tremendously excellent at being in a space of complete non-judgment and forgiveness when I do, which is really complicated from a guilt perspective. And then when you flip, right, that flip occurs, then you're down here, right? When you're down there, you need, from my point of view, this is definitely my life experience. You need at least two things. Well, maybe three, actually. One is you need to actually have something like a practice or tools. And given my background as a nerd, I'll sometimes think about them computationally. Like you need a boot P, like a loader. Like, okay, you're down there. What are the things that you can do? Oh, you can go run. You can work. You can chop wood. And there are things that you can do that with your body. Your body is sort of your fundamental binding to reality that doesn't get stuck. Do that, and when the space clears, then you can start reconnecting. Something like that. Restorative or redemptive practices that get you out of that downward spiral loop and allow you to begin getting back into the upward spiral.
The notion of a ritual.
Yeah, some kind of ritual.
Yeah.
And those can be very tricky, right? Because the thing that is involved in that downward spiral is agentic. Right? It has, there's some reason, there's something about being down there that it wants, and it's not it's good at it, right? It can weave up stories, and it can separate you from rituals, and it prevents you from going in places that you know are the right place, and it does it well, right? It uses all the traumas and tools and defense mechanisms and narrative capacities that are part of your Eunice, and it uses them against you, and it's better at it because it's focused, it's deliberate. Yeah. All right. So this is then part number 2, in my case at least. And I don't know if this is universal, but I certainly ain't gonna hurt. And that is the love of a good woman. My wife is amazing, right? Her capacity to show up with just the right grace, and it's weird. Like I can't even imagine how she achieves this degree of subtlety, a level of kindness that softens and opens and allows self-forgiveness to reblossom, but not the clumsy kindness that actually reinforces the darkness of the downward spiral, right? Because that's a tricky place. I mean, there's no words for it, right? So
yeah,
and having somebody like that in your life what I would say is, I'm going to say for me, requisite. I don't imagine that I could pull it off. I could make this journey without that. I don't know if that's universal, but
Yeah.
It ain't going to hurt.
Yeah, I resonate with that strongly. That I told my wife, I think 2 days ago, that I have found myself engaged in the most wisdom that I have found as a consequence of interactions with her. Like without question.
Without question.
Yeah.
And then the third is having been on the road enough times to be able to remember that that grace, like, oh, right, there's that point where as you're moving up from the downward spiral, you remember, and the more you've done it, the more it's like waking up from a dream. Like, oh, oof, oh yeah, okay, this is reality again.
Yeah.
And the further you are from it, right? And this is, I guess, is the key. If you've spent, I don't know, let's just say you're 33, and you therefore maybe potentially have spent the last, 30 years lost. Like, no, to use the language we're using, you've been in the world of sin entirely for 3 decades. Well, remembering that the fact that grace and the feeling of that is not trivial. That's a significant issue. And so it's a journey, right? It's a real serious. Now, as you get there, you need space. By the way, from my experience, it ain't going to last that long. Other people may have had different experiences. That could be sweet to have like a once redeemed, and then forever. That'd be a
well, that's such a trap, right? Like, that's one of the things that is that is one of the things that is so like ingrained in my psyche from the kind of like Anabaptist Christian upbringing. It was like, there's going to be this point at which you're like, if God really does the work in your heart, let's say, and you're really born again, it's like, boom, now we're going, right? There's this expectation of completion. And that is something that often, I think, reinforces the negative loops, because it calls into the, I like how you use the notion of being in a dream, right? It calls into the dream this, okay, I'm going to use the notion of faith, and I don't know if that's okay with you, but the faith as being the thing that keeps me connected into the process, let's say. And there's this aspect of a doubt that involves futility that persecutes the faith. Let's say that's maybe not the best way to say it.
I get it. Let me do it. Let me take the
first
pop out. I know that I'm in dialogue with somebody who was brought up in the Christian church.
Yeah.
So I'm obviously consenting to the fact that we'll be using terms that come from that lineage. And this is the point. I am joyfully consenting to that. Use the words that work for you, and then we'll begin to actually get to the point that is behind those words. Right?
Sure.
So
sure.
I'm not going to have any trouble with that. You said it beautifully, by the way. I would actually say that you said it beautifully just then.
Thank you.
Persecutes. Yes. All right. Doubt. Woo. Yeah. The tricky thing is to actually get it, not just do the chat GPT thing and say the words in the proper order.
Yeah.
Okay. So what are we saying here? There's something like connection, like faith in the sense of connection. Like I'll like picture. If we imagine, and I was just listening to John and Bishop Maximus, so I might, by the way, be importing some Orthodox symbiology, and
which is great.
If we imagine this notion of grace, right, as being I'm not going to say this at all right, so just bear with me. The connection, the continuity, the actual being in wholeness or synergy with God, right? Okay, I'm gonna say that's a very nice way of thinking about the notion of faith. Right? Faith is literally that. And if that is present, like if that's there, then you always have something which is held right beyond in a fashion that is beyond even your capacity to get out of it. And so it's the place that you can go. You can go into that place, and from that place you can return back out. Right. So sort of this movement back and forth. And okay, now this the tricky thing that when you talk about that notion, if you're up here and there's completion. I like the visual. Like, oh yeah, let's get subtle on that, because that's like there's a cutting knife there. There's a sharpness to it. It's like oh yeah, and Maximus actually put this in and I don't want to create a 30 years war, but very specifically in the distance between the Eastern and the Western way of doing things. That and a lot of what John's work is that the narrative, right, the mentalization of it, the propositional, right? If you tell a story and you subordinate yourself to the story, you already flipped, even though you may not know it. And one of the consequences of that is that when you fail to live up to the story, you've replaced faith with narrative completion. You didn't notice it, right? You've actually been separated from faith, and you've grounded yourself in narrative. And what you say? What was the word you used? I lost it. It was a great word.
Futility?
No. What this doubt does to faith?
Oh, persecutes.
Persecutes. Oh, such a good word. Yeah. What I have there is almost like an awl, right? Just hammering away at the stone. Yes. Hammers at the root.
Yes.
And yeah. So I think this is absolutely correct, right? I think this is the most challenging, tricky business of. I get why narrative is a tool, right? And by the way, this is largely what I was trying to say in that tweet about ideology. I get why narrative is a tool, and it's very closely related to the ego putting itself on the throne. Right? The narrative putting itself on the throne. There you go.
Yeah.
What's on the throne is faith, grace, right? That's the throne. But when the narrative puts itself there, you're stuck because you've been moved from whatever aspect, with the wholeness of yourself, or whatever the way that you were able to be in relationship with faith, to a different aspect of yourself, which doesn't have that capacity at all, right? That's not its thing, right? It tells good stories, it creates good models. But when it usurps, when it says, oh no, I've created a simulacrum of faith that I'm going to interpose between you and faith. Oh, guess what? It doesn't work. You're not going to ever actually get to that narrative closure. So now you're really in trouble.
Yeah.
Because you didn't notice that you were separated from this by a faculty that is a very critical faculty, and you become lost and begin to identify the whole of yourself with this faculty, which doesn't have the capacity to do this. So now you're trying to kind of like, this isn't quite the right metaphor, but it's almost there. It's like well, this is actually the right metaphor. You're trying to go, there's a beautiful, you're thirsty, and there's a cup of water to your right, and you're trying to get there by walking left.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, like you've got a mirror, something in your universe's mirror image. So you're trying to get to the right by walking left, and this is confusing, right? Because you're walking in a direction, and you begin to lose confidence. I'm not going to use faith, but you begin to lose confidence that walking in the direction that seems like the right direction can get you there, because you haven't realized that it's actually just about turning right. And for whatever reason, because we were just talking about it, this faculty that you've lost yourself in, that has convinced you, or that's not even quite right, has become the agent of something that is interested in convincing you. It is actually the whole of you and the whole of agency. So you got to get yourself out of that before you can get back here. All right.
Yeah, and I liked. Okay, so I want to pick up on one thing. That was beautiful. Yes, that's fantastic. And sorry, one other thing to throw on before I do. This whole thing of narrative. The way I've been thinking of it is that it's something like the right narrative is what you have to follow back to realize that the narrative has been put on the throne. And that would be how I would talk about Christianity as a thing, as a narrative, right? Because there's this whole kind of like dialectic that's been going on in this little corner of the internet about like narrative being fundamental to reality. And anyway, so I'll leave that off to the side because I don't really want to go into that too much. But there was something when you were talking about the persecution of faith as being like this chopping at the roots. I think that's such a great metaphor because the thing that makes it so powerful once, so let's say narrative is on the throne, is that it convinces you that it has grace, right? Like you said, it puts something there, or faith, right? Whatever it is, it'll say, oh, here's faith. This is what it is. It's confidence now, right? When you said it's the confidence to keep walking that way, it's like, oh yeah, that's what faith is. It's like, no, that's not what faith is. That's precisely not what faith is.
Yeah. This is. I think this actually ends up being quite important. I'm not sure why, but I found myself very much doing it. Like you said, can I use the word faith? Yes. Why? Well, there seems to be something about properly noticing that we've been sold simulacra. We've been sold a bill of goods, where we've been given words that present themselves as being something, A, that they're not, and B, that we actually really, really need. And so those are both important, right? And because we need them, we need to begin whatever we need to do to be able to get access to them. We need to do that. And in many cases, having a name and allowing that name to orient us so that we can reorient ourselves and then rediscover what it is the name is endeavoring to name. Right? We even have this in this now corner of the internet, the distinction between symbol and sign or word, right? We need to re-symbolize, like, okay, the word faith is supposed to be something like a symbol, and it's supposed to orient us so that we can find our way to the thing, and not pretend or get lost to think that the word is the thing. It's a lot of work. So, sure. Oh, can I put a little caveat right here? Again, at the kind of metacognitive level. So you and I are having a dialogue, and I feel very comfortable and actually quite interested in the lineage of the West, which happens to be Christian. So, and I think that's quite honorable. It's unlikely that for 2,000 years, an entire group of people like totally screwed everything up completely. And it's very likely. In fact, quite the opposite is much more likely. There's a very large number of extremely wise people, quite earnestly dedicated to being in right relationship with reality and be useful and good to A, honor them, and B, learn from them. Okay. Now, it's possible that if we choose to share this, that some number of people who watch it aren't Christian. I mean, they may be Muslim, which probably would create trouble if they are familiar with dialogos. But they may be very far from that. And they may be secularists of some various flavor. They may even be atheists. And therefore, this may be a very odd and maybe off-putting conversation, in which case I would return you to the beginning of the conversation, layer 1 and layer 2. If our use of the word faith makes you angry, well, then that's something you're going to need to work on. And if it makes you feel like we're talking about something that's wrong, then we're at layer 2. Let's do a mapping. Right? So if that individual is in this room and willing to enter into a space of dialogos, I am confident that we could actually get there. We could say, okay, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about this kind of a thing. And there may be some really hard stuff, right? Like big stuff, like infinite or transcendent, right? That will require quite a journey for someone who spent a lot of time focusing on a sort of physicalist, reductionist way of thinking. Which is to say, I don't at all being mean, which is to say, quite being lost in that aspect, part of themselves that like to pretend it's all of themselves. Okay, end of caveat.
Well, let me just extend on it briefly. It's like, if you're a Christian watching this and it gives you a sense of like, it becomes a justification for that say at that third level, you have these different layers of language models, and you take it as a justification to give preeminence to that specific language model. It will likely get in the way of you doing the other three things. Right? Like, because if you're going to do number two well of disambiguating, or let's say achieving resonance of protocols, you have to be flexible with the language that you're speaking enough to say, okay, you're a reductive, you use the reductive secularist model of language. Fine. Let's, like, I'm happy to attempt to make a connection between those such that we can talk about the same thing. And the fact that you don't like my model, or I don't like your model, or it doesn't feel comfortable for me, maybe let's use that better instead. If it doesn't feel resonant for me, that's an issue of, you have to get level one right first, and then you can go to level two. But if you're privileging one of the language models, you can't do level one first. Something like that.
I believe this is right.
It doesn't change anything about the truth behind the models.
No, it doesn't at all. Very, very much. I was even the opposite. It actually brings you into right relationship with the capital T truth. I felt this a lot in that conversation with Maximus, Bishop Maximus, and John. And I'm extremely naive about Greek or orthodoxy, even to the point where I don't even know if the word Greek belongs before. Like, I'm extremely naive about orthodoxy, and I'm pretty familiar with the fact that there's at least two flavors. Like, there's a Russian flavor and a Greek flavor, and probably several more. Like, this is literally, like, there's almost what do we call it? Like a midwit, 22-year-old college educated, like, a relationship where, okay, the word orthodoxy sounds yucky, right? It sounds like you're being really attached to a whole bunch of words. It sounds like the kind of thing that I would not like. Okay. If that's like your entire identity, then it's, and if I'm coming at it that way, we're going to have a real hard time getting to dialogue. Now, then I listened to, and I don't actually assume that now at all, because I'm not 22. So I listen to Bishop Maximus, and I hear him talking. What I hear him saying is what you just said. It's like, okay, here's the way that we say it in Greek, and now we're already, or we're even noticing that the words, like he will articulate the words we're using. The point is they're an orienting basis, and we're not getting caught up in that, and we're trying to figure out how to do this well. And there's an awareness that there are a lot of people in our lineage who have done this really well. Okay, so we're going to listen to them. And we're going to try to be very careful to use that, because one of the things I've learned, and you actually, it's funny you referenced this earlier. I have a 20-year-old child. I know more about raising kids than you do. Doesn't mean I'm better at it, but I know more about it, which means there's certain things that I definitely could give you. Well, I'm also very aware of the fact that a 70-year-old man who's lived a very, very profound life has wisdom that I do not have. Right? That does not mean that the whole of them is universally wiser than me and the whole of me, but it definitely means they have wisdom I do not have. So it would behoove me, my own wisdom tells me deeply, it would behoove me to listen to them carefully and endeavor to the best that I can to get as much of that as I can get. Because life is brutally hard, and trying to do it all first person, like make all the mistakes yourself, that ain't going to work out. That's going to be a tough gig. That's going to be one that's going to make you hope that the Buddhists and reincarnation is a good idea, because you're going to have to do that all to make any progress. Nice, by the way. I really appreciate you like speaking it from the other direction. That was I agree. Like what you said, like that feels very right. And one, it's not for me to say, but two, I wouldn't even have thought of it.
Thank you. That's I appreciate that. But I think it's probably because in a lot of ways, I've started this YouTube channel, Climbing on Mount Sophia, and you can use that. Like is the symbol for what I feel like we are doing in, say, this conversation, right? climbing together in this landscape of language in such a way that if we look through each other's eyes at the way we relate to the different language pieces, they fall into place in such a way that they are symbolic to us and to Sophia. And but a major factor in this journey, whatever this journey is supposed to be, has been a precisely what's the right word? It's like a wrestling with, right? It's a wrestling with this this thing of Christianity, or this, that for me, when I grew up, it was such a hard, like a concrete prison of, right? You're in this, right? And it's been this slow, like, pushing at this, but never like it's never like a sledgehammer breaking it down. Although at times it feels like that, but it's like always trying to, like, well, even if you do take a sledgehammer to something, like, go back to the pile of rubble and find what was there and bring it back. And so I'm very, very cognizant and aware of the ways in which I find the formulation of propositions that felt to be prisons to me in my younger years. When I come back around to them, can actually afford themselves as symbols, looking from a different angle. And so that's a very tricky, like, it's such a tricky place.
Can I? All right. Well, there's two things. One,
yeah,
we're getting to the end of our time.
I
noticed that both in terms of, like, the clock, but also, like, my bladder and my hips. I'm sitting here too. This is really, really good for me. This is an area that I've got, frankly, a lot of attention on. This exactly where you are. And let me just put something out there to chew on, and maybe we can continue the conversation later. This feels like it has to do something with how to properly bring someone into a lineage.
Yes.
Words like child rearing, words like education, like there's an error, like, because you said it exactly right. The propositions that you received or perceived probably at a certain point in time in your life, right? Probably not when you were 8, but maybe when you were 11 or 14, as a prison, which then you had to break out of to be a human, right? To be an agent, to be able to be in proper relationship with grace at all, anyway. With a sledgehammer, right? Not even like, birthing out of it proper, gently. And then you go back, you're like, wow, that rubble, holy smokes! Like, if I actually come at it from where I am now, I realized there was symbolism embedded in it, right? So it would be nice if we could simultaneously not have to break out of in that level of destructiveness, and therefore also not have to go to a pile of rubble to find our symbols. It'd be nice if we could kind of, like, smoothly move to the necessary arc of being a human and going through the stages and changes that's necessary of being a human, and land in a fully rich lineage the whole way in eustress, right? The whole way in the pocket. Like, that would be really good. And so let's put that as an inquiry. Like, if we actually want to do this thing, like build the church, I would say that particular piece is one of the primary building blocks. I'll flag it. The religion that's not a religion is going to have to do that part real good.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And I would love to talk about that. Nice. Because I would say that's something like the central interest that I have, playing in the field of, the ideas, or whatever you want to say for that.
I have some ideas too. I mean, this whole parenting is very instructive. And so, let's do that.
Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this and appreciated it a lot. And thank you for taking the time to talk to me. And again, to back out one frame I've gained a great deal of skillfulness in my life thanks to interacting with you. Now actually in real time, but also from a distance. So I want to thank you for that, and I appreciate the way in which you hold yourself and in relation to the world and others. So thank you.
You're very welcome.